What would you do if you found out you only had 2 months to live? Watch what happened to Christiana when she discovered she had only 2 months to live. Her story will leave you speechless. Christiana lived in an old, creaky house that looked like it could fall apart if the wind blew too hard. Her neighbors often joked that even the spiders in her house were stingy, weaving only half-finished webs. She drove a rusty sedan that wheezed like a dying animal every time it started. Despite being an accountant with a decent salary, Christiana refused to spend money on anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. She ate canned beans for dinner, turned off the heat in winter to save on electricity, and wore clothes so outdated they could be called vintage if not for the stains. Her favorite phrase was, "Why waste money when you don't have to?" One morning, Christiana woke up to find her pillow covered in strands of her hair. Panicking, she rushed to the bathroom, only to see more hair falling out as she brushed it. "This can't be happening," she exclaimed. At the hospital, Christiana nervously fidgeted in the waiting room. When the doctor finally called her in, his face looked serious. "Christiana, I have some bad news. You have cancer. It's advanced, and you have about 2 months left to live." Christiana's jaw dropped. 2 months, she whispered. She left the hospital in a daze, feeling like the world was spinning. By the time she got home, she collapsed on her old, lumpy couch crying. After crying for several hours, she said to herself, "What's the point of all this saving if I'm just going to die?" For the first time in her life, Christiana made a bold decision. She was going to spend every last penny of her savings. The next day, Christiana walked into the fanciest mall in town, looking wildly out of place in her faded sweater and scuffed shoes. People stared because nobody of low standards visits the mall. It is only meant for rich folks, but Christiana didn't care. The way she dressed made her look like she couldn't afford anything in the mall. She entered a high-end boutique, and the sales associate gave her a quick glance, clearly skeptical. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone dripping with doubt. "Yes," Christiana said with a grin. "I want your most expensive dresses, shoes, and handbags." Money is not the problem. The sales associate's eyes nearly popped out of her head. An hour later, Christiana strutted out of the store with bags piled so high she could barely see over them. She felt like a new person. As she walked down the road, she asked herself with a smile, "Christiana, is this you?" Next on Christiana's list was a trip to Bali in Indonesia. She booked the flight in economy class, still clinging to a bit of her old habits. But as soon as she boarded the plane, she regretted it. The seats were cramped, and her knees practically touched her chin. "How do people live like this?" she grumbled. When the flight attendant walked by, Mary muttered, "They make these seats so small just to save money. It's robberies." The flight attendant, clearly annoyed, replied, "Well, ma'am, this section is for people who don't have money." Christiana snapped. "Fine, I'll upgrade to first class," she shouted loud enough for half the plane to hear. Everyone turned to stare as Christiana stomped to the first-class cabin, where she dropped thousands of dollars on an upgrade without batting an eye. As she sank into her plush seat and sipped champagne, she smirked at the shocked faces of the economy passengers. "Now this is living," she thought. In Bali, Christiana had planned to go all out, and she did. She booked a villa that could easily belong in a movie, perched high on a cliff, with a private pool that seemed to melt into the ocean. The staff treated her like royalty, catering to her every request. She spent her days on helicopter rides, zooming over volcanoes and waterfalls, and her nights dining on meals that looked too perfect to eat. She even had a personal butler who memorized her favorite drink by the second day. Life felt like a dream. One afternoon, Christiana decided to step away from the luxury bubble. She asked her driver to take her to a local village she'd heard about. It was small and quiet, a world away from the sleek resorts and fancy restaurants she'd been enjoying. While wandering the dusty streets, she saw a group of kids kicking around a ball made from rags tied together. Their laughter echoed through the air as they ran barefoot, completely caught up in their game. Christiana stopped to watch. Their joy was infectious, but she couldn't ignore the fact that their clothes were worn out, and some of them looked like they hadn't had a proper meal in days. A few of the kids noticed her and waved. One little boy ran over to show her the ball, his smile so wide it was impossible not to grin back. She crouched down to talk to him, asking his name and about the game they were playing. The boy's enthusiasm was endless, but when she asked if he went to school, his face fell. "Not anymore," he said quietly. That stuck with Christiana. When she got back to her villa that evening, she couldn't stop thinking about the kids. She looked at her packed suitcase, her plans for another gourmet dinner, and her itinerary filled with spa appointments and private tours. It all suddenly felt off. The next morning, Christiana went back to the village, this time with her driver loaded up with bags of supplies. She bought the kids proper soccer balls, cleats, and jerseys. But she didn't stop there. She went to the local market and bought enough food for every family in the village. She met with the village elders and asked how she could help more. When one elder mentioned that some families couldn't afford school fees, Christiana quietly took care of them. She even hired someone to start teaching the kids soccer and set up a mini field so they'd have a safe place to play. Word spread quickly, and soon, the whole village was buzzing. Families came out of their homes to thank her. The kids couldn't stop cheering and racing around the field with their new gear. Christiana sat on the sidelines, watching them play, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a kind of happiness that couldn't be bought. Later that week, she was invited to a community feast in her honor. The villagers cooked dishes she'd never heard of, but couldn't get enough of. They sang songs, danced, and made her feel like one of them. She stayed until late into the night, laughing and sharing stories with people she'd just met but felt like she'd known forever. Christiana's trip didn't end how she expected. She still stayed in her villa and enjoyed the ocean views, but now she spent most of her days with the village kids and their families. When it was time to leave, they all came to see her off, lining the streets and waving until her car was out of sight. Back on the plane, she looked out the window, thinking about everything she'd done. This was supposed to be the first and last vacation of her life. She remembered again she is going to die in a few weeks. She burst down in tears, but her inner self felt fulfilled. Back home, Christiana threw herself a grand farewell party. She invited everyone in the neighborhood, from the mailman to the barista who always got her coffee order wrong every time. The guests were stunned to see Christiana in her glamorous new wardrobe, serving gourmet food and champagne. She was extra nice to everyone, but nobody noticed she was about to die. "I want to celebrate my life while I still can," she said, raising a glass. A week later, Christiana lay on her bed, staring at the ceiling, counting down the hours she believed were her last. The doctor's words still echoed in her mind, a few weeks at most. She'd made peace with it, or so she thought. She'd spent the week reflecting, writing letters to loved ones, and making arrangements for her final goodbye. But as she lay there, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She almost ignored it, but something made her pick it up. The caller ID showed the hospital. "Mrs. Christiana." The voice on the other end said, hesitating, "We're terribly sorry, but there's been a mistake with your test results. You're not terminally ill. In fact, you're completely healthy." For a moment, she said nothing. Then, an uncontrollable laugh bubbled up from deep inside her. She laughed so hard tears rolled down her face. "You're telling me I spent the last few months preparing to die when I could have been living?" From that day on, Christiana was a changed woman. She still saved money, but she no longer hoarded it. She traveled, donated to charities, and lived life to the fullest. And every time she sipped champagne in first class or bought a round of coffee for the entire cafe, she thought, now this is how you spend your life.